So last week we introduced the class with the Enlightenment, the movement from, well, if we simplify, really oversimplify these eras of intellectual history in Europe and then later into America, we can start with the Middle Ages, which is looking to the church, church orthodoxy, not just the Bible directly. Keep in mind, most people can't read, it's in Latin or Greek. And so they're looking to the church to sort of tell them what's true about the world, what to do with their lives, to give them purpose and direction. In the Renaissance, there's a rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman, Latin literature, art, philosophy, and that sort of thing. And that gives us like some other authorities that, this is still a very orthodox time period, but they're able to integrate these ancient writers, philosophers with their current beliefs. And so, in addition to that, we have new directions in science and architecture, things like that. But they're still, for the most part, looking to the past, looking to some past authority. What distinguishes the Enlightenment is this recognition that, past authorities have made as many mistakes as they have discovered truths. So we can question everything, as Descartes essentially says. And that doesn't mean past authorities were entirely wrong. We can find out the things they were right about. And indeed, Enlightenment authors would consistently say, oh, this is proven true, whereas these other things are proven false. But the focus was on your intellect. You're using your mind to look at the facts in front of you to sort of, the evidence as well as the sort of rational principles that we use to interpret that evidence and make generalizations from it. And it made people very independent, made people very skeptical of past authorities. It also made people skeptical of emotion because we recognized that our own emotions can get in the way of our ability to reason. And so one of the dominant genres of art at the time was satire. That is where you're looking at something that's been taken seriously in the past and you're saying, well, if you actually look at it and apply it to this situation, it seems kind of silly, doesn't it? It's not an outright rejection. It's just not something that's been taken very seriously is all of a sudden not taken so seriously anymore. So in England, we have Jonathan Swift is probably the most famous example of satire. In France, we have Molière's Tartuffe, we have Voltaire's Candide, but all of which show someone traveling through a familiar social scenario or a familiar social scenario that's in a completely fantastic world, like in Gulliver's Travels of Jonathan Swift. It's essentially England, but there's giant people in one area and Lilliputians, tiny people in another, but there's very familiar personalities doing very familiar things that, from this perspective, seem kind of silly. Voltaire's Candide sort of does the same thing. He travels through Europe at a time when things are going very, very bad, but there's this ideological demand that you're supposed to say that this is the best, this is as it's supposed to be, or, reconcile these beliefs that, everything's going fine, nothing to see here, with the fact that, no, in fact, it's really not. And we can laugh at satire. We can see that, oh, this thing I was scared of is not actually so scary, or this thing I was taking seriously isn't actually all that it was cracked up to be. So Enlightenment, satire, and skepticism more generally can loosen the hold that superstition and prejudice and arbitrary authority imposed by institutions can hold over us. So, and of course, the Declaration of Independence pointed out that the king is just a man. He's supposed to be doing a job. He has one job. That job depends on the consent of the governed, and that not exactly satire, but it's taking something people hadn't stopped to think about. This authority has a purpose. The king has a job to do, and if we're all going to be loyal to him, then he needs to be doing that job. The Declaration of Independence is a long list of all the ways that he failed to do that job and why the colonists needed to overthrow that government and institute new government. But the Enlightenment, when it comes to politics, comes to an end with the Reign of Terror, the French Revolution, which was modeled on the exact same ideals as the American Revolution. It did not go the same way that the American Revolution did. It quickly turned into this just massive outpouring of violence against everyone. At first, because of what they had done, aristocrats who had abused people in the common people. But then it just became anybody who's an aristocrat. And then it just became anybody who's not entirely against murdering all the aristocrats. And then it became anybody who might be suspected of not being entirely in favor of murdering all the aristocrats. So very quickly, everybody became a target. Because after the king is overthrown, then what? What do we do now? How do we organize ourselves? What is our purpose going to be? And we can see the same sort of problem with skepticism at the individual level. If I'm skeptical of the authorities who told me I need to be this, okay, but now I'm on my own, I'm making my own decisions, so what am I going to do? And when it comes to being skeptical of emotion, okay, I don't want emotions getting in the way of my reason. Reason is a tool that I can use to achieve my purposes, to achieve my goals. Okay, but without emotion, how are you going to find your goals? Like, how is one goal going to seem more important than another? And of course, this wasn't completely unknown in the Enlightenment. David Hume, one of the founders of the Enlightenment, said that reason is the slave of emotion, and that's exactly as it should be. The thing is, we just have to be aware of our emotions. We have to decide which emotions we're going to listen to, which ones we're not, and when. And when it comes to picking a goal, that would be when the emotion is very important. So when it comes to art, during the Middle Ages, allegory was very popular. It was this story that would teach you a lesson about some general principle of life. And that wasn't the only type of story that was told, but it was a very common expectation that literature is there to teach you a lesson. In the Enlightenment, satire sort of did the opposite. It challenged, it told you like what not to take too seriously. And of course, these weren't the only forms of literature or art during this time. But you can see that there are different ideas about what literature can or should do. At first, it might just be a way to teach a lesson, like a parable or Aesop's fables or something like that, like in an allegory. Then satire is the anti-allegory. It tells you what to question or what you can sort of laugh at or at least not take too seriously. But the Romantic movement is the movement that, the literary movement that broke away from Enlightenment's focus on reason. It wasn't necessarily anti-reason or anti-science or anti-anything else, but it was it was asking the question, what do we do now? How do we determine our direction? What do we think of the French Revolution? What do we think of the power of emotion? Is emotion good? Is emotion bad? Is emotion something we need to control? Is it something that we want to control us? And when and where and how do we enact that? So we're going to start this week with William Wordsworth, his preface to a book of poetry called Lyrical Ballads. And his co-author in that book, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. You're going to see that they each wrote different types of poems for that work, but they had different purposes. And so you're going to read Wordsworth's preface to that, and then you're going to read part of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, that is a biography of literature. And he's going to be explaining what he and Wordsworth were thinking and what they were talking about when they were planning to write this. And you may have already read Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. You're going to see that Mary Shelley refers to that in her later preface to Frankenstein. But you'll notice that Wordsworth and Coleridge are really trying to say, from a poet's perspective, what now? What do we write about? What are we going to focus on? What should we focus on? What do people expect us to focus on? And is that actually what we should? And they're going to shake up the expectations of the readers very deliberately, because they're both going to explain that that was part of their intention. And they're going to say, this is not to tell people, like in a satire, that they shouldn't take this thing seriously. It's not to tell people that they need to believe something. So it's not allegory. It's not satire. It's not teaching you a lesson. You're not going to learn bits of knowledge or general knowledge from their poetry. That's not their point. Their point is to stir your emotions, and that might seem at odds with the Enlightenment prioritization of reason. But while you're in the poem, while you're reading that poem, the poem is an experience separate from your day-to-day life, even if, as we're going to see they intentionally do, even if you're examining things that are familiar, that are part of your day-to-day life. Wordsworth says in his preface that his principal object was to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate or describe them throughout as far as possible in the selection of language that was really used by people. So the way people think is discernible in the way they talk. So he wants to write poetry that uses real life used language, but at the same time to throw over them a certain coloring of the imagination whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual aspect. That is, I want to take something that is familiar, more familiar than you might think poetry is supposed to bother with. Poetry is supposed to be high and take you away to some sort of idealistic area. But no, he says, we're gonna keep it grounded. But we're going to re-examine those things, not in a satirical way, not in a way that's making fun of it, but to say, have you really looked at this? Have you really thought about this? Have you ever considered this in connection to this? And emotions are going to be one of those things that he wants to provoke, and he wants us to then examine, not just sort of give into, but to actually present it to our consciousness. Instead of having emotion controlling our reason or our thinking, it is holding up emotion, feeling it, experiencing it, but also making us aware of it. And as Coleridge will tell us that his contribution to lyrical ballads, things like the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, were very supernatural. They were not day-to-day life. But in those supernatural, fantastical narratives, he's going to bring in certain components of social thinking that are something that are pretty universal, whether we're in our day-to-day life or in this fantastic world like in Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And it's because of this theme in their writing that I'm adding in Victor Shklovsky's art as technique. Now, this is not from the Romantic movement. This is from much later. This is a Russian formalist writing in the early part of the 20th century. But he's going to describe, he's going to give us this terminology. He's giving it in Russian, and we've translated it since then and used words like defamiliarization. It's where an art deliberately takes something that is something you're familiar with, but then holds it up and says, have you ever thought of it this way? So there is a sort of skepticism, sort of Enlightenment skepticism, like satire. In fact, satire would be one way of defamiliarizing something important, something that seems scary or something you couldn't question, and saying, no, actually, let's question it. But the Romantic way of doing that, the Romantic writers are doing the same thing. They just don't have that sort of scorn or smugness that comes across in satire. And so he's going to use an example from Leo Tolstoy, in which a horse is speaking, and the horse is describing the human custom of private property, which just makes perfect sense to us. You don't even have to wonder, what is private property? Does it make any sense? Of course it does. That's just common sense. But this horse is describing it in ways that make it seem kind of strange. And you can see from the horse's point of view how private property actually doesn't make a lot of sense. It's not just a natural state. And natural states are going to be another focus of Romantic poetry and literature, because they're sort of wondering, what is a natural state? How much of what we are and how much of the way we think is just nature, our human nature? How much of it is imposed on us by authorities, by society, by groupthink? And just like everything else, they're not going to tell us, like, here's the answer. Here's how much of us is nature, and here's how much of us is socialized. They're just going to give us examples and ask us to think about that, put us in situations where nature is front and center and people behave differently. So after Wordsworth and Coleridge, and then after Shklovsky, we are going to see an idealized romantic figure. That is what has become known as the Byronic hero. That's named after George Gordon, Lord Byron, an English poet who was born an aristocrat. He was very important, had the option of a very easy life, but he just couldn't sit still. He couldn't hold his tongue. He couldn't, refrain from questioning things that he wasn't supposed to question, doing things that was not polite society, and really sort of looking for something to be. He was someone with just so much energy, artistic energy, as well as I don't know, real world energy, that he traveled a lot. He wrote a lot while he was traveling. He participated in some of the actual revolutions that were happening in Europe at the time. He ends up dying fighting for the Greeks against the Ottoman Empire in the Greek struggle for independence. And he's going to be very important to introducing Mary Shelley's Frankenstein for reasons you'll see in a later reading. But he was first very influential on another poet, that is Percy Shelley. He is going to be Mary Shelley's husband, but even before that, Percy Shelley and George Gordon, Lord Byron, who we just call Byron, they traveled together, they exchanged ideas, they wrote a lot of poetry that a lot of it was very much Romantic and Enlightenment shaped, when it was very sort of pro-democracy, questioning the aristocracy, questioning all sorts of authorities. But the personality that comes through from their writing is this sort of individual who is at odds with his society. He can't fit in with normal people, and so there's this, whereas Coleridge and Wordsworth were very interested in just ordinary people, Byron and Shelley, or the Byronic hero at least, doesn't really fit in anywhere. Not with the aristocracy, not with common people, not with anybody. And so they have to sort of go out into nature and pursue some sort of quest, or even if they don't really know what they're looking for, they're getting away from something, or they're chasing after something, or they just need to go. They have this energy that they have to act on. So we're going to start with Percy Shelley's poem Alastor, or Spirit of Solitude. That is the entire title. You'll see that a lot. A name, colon, or, and then an alternative name. And we're just going to read an excerpt from it. But you're also going to read Percy Shelley's preface to it. Here's what he was thinking when he wrote this poem. And you get some insight into not only what he wants to show us. Notice he's not teaching us something, but he wants to show us something. And what sorts of thoughts he's trying to elicit in his reader. So he's really focused on emotion, getting us to understand this emotion that is sort of more extreme than most of us would actually experience. And we're calling this the Byronic hero, but we're going to start with Shelley's version and then use the example of Byron's Manfred. Now, Byron had been writing these kinds of poetic protagonists for years by this point. His poem Childe Harold's Pilgrimage is probably the earliest one of his examples of this. But Manfred gives me some very concise lines. You don't have to read quite as much poetry. They're all these poems are much longer. But there's some segments I can take out and then show you to read that will give you an idea of how these guys were feeling in this world that was politically, intellectually, artistically tumultuous. That a lot was happening. A lot of things that had just been, predictable and rigid for centuries were now being overturned, and these individuals were sort of looking for a direction to go. They had this emotion that they didn't want to just replace with reason. They had to find a purpose, a direction for their energy, and they weren't really sure how to do that. So they go out away from society into nature, looking for the coldest or the loftiest mountain or the most extreme conditions, because that's what their temper, their disposition needed. It wasn't finding in society, which was too settled, too much inertia, too little happening, too little to do, nothing for their energy to apply itself to. And as you can imagine, this Byronic hero, who's out in nature interacting with supernatural spirits, is a poetic creation. But all of us, every single individual, no matter how detached you are from society, we all have people around us. We all have people connected to us socially, who are affected by our actions, whether we are thinking about them at the time or not. And Percy Shelley was married, and even before he was married to Mary Shelley, she was Mary Wollstonecraft. You're going to see her referred to as M.W. Godwin later, because her father was William Godwin, who was a famous writer, a famous political leftist. He was a friend of Thomas Paine. He was very anti-monarchy. He Thomas Paine would come visit the Godwin family when Mary was a little girl, as would Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Her mother, whose name was Mary Wollstonecraft, she was also a famous author. She wrote at first, when Edmund Burke wrote a tract attacking Thomas Paine and criticizing the American Revolution as well as the French Revolution and the very idea of revolution, Mary Wollstonecraft, Thomas Paine had written The Rights of Man, Edmund Burke criticized it, and then Mary Wollstonecraft wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Man, talking about Thomas Paine's Rights of Man, vindicating those ideas. But she followed that up, especially with a lot of criticism that she's just a woman. What does she know? She followed that up with an even more famous work of hers, which is Vindication of the Rights of Woman. So this wasn't anything in any way anti-male. It was just her trying to bring to the attention of the male intellectuals that, no, we're here too. We have to deal with these things that you might not be aware of. But, we are just as much a part of this revolutionary age as you are. So those were Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley's parents. Like I said, when you read Polidori's account of the night in Geneva in 1816, she'll just be described as M.W. Godwin, but that's Mary Shelley. So you're going to read her introduction to Frankenstein from a later edition, although this might be an edition that you have. The 1831 edition of Frankenstein had a lot of changes from the 1817, 1818, 1819. I think it's usually published as the 1818 edition, but the third edition of Frankenstein is the 1831 edition, and in that she writes a much longer preface. In the original version, the 1818, she didn't identify herself. Nobody knew who she was. People speculated. Some people even thought it was William Godwin who wrote it, but her name was not on that first edition. By 1831, she was, yes, I'm Mary Shelley. Here's how this novel came about. And she's very biographical. She will describe some of her influences, but she's also going to introduce the specific night that the idea occurred to her for Frankenstein in the context of being at this chateau in Switzerland with Percy Shelley, with George Gordon, Lord Byron, with Byron's personal physician and an aspiring writer named John William Polidori. And Polidori later becomes famous for an idea that actually Byron had on this night that he didn't develop very far, but Polidori develops it, and it is, I think, the earliest vampire account, the earliest vampire story in English. This is a good 70 years before Bram Stoker's Dracula. It's before Carmilla. So as far as like an actual like fleshed out description of a vampire, this is the earliest in English in literature. But what I want you to read is his account of the night that this group got together and came up with, each of them decided to come up with a scary story, a ghost story or monster story. And it was, of course, expected that somebody like Byron or Percy Shelley would come up with the most artistic, most romantic, and also scariest supernatural story. But Mary just blew them all away with her idea. So she's going to introduce that story. Then you're going to read Polidori's account of that night. And then you'll read Percy Shelley's introduction to the 1818 edition of Frankenstein, because people knew who he was, and he was able to give it a little bit of notoriety to get people to buy the books. But at this point, people didn't know that his wife Mary was the one who wrote it. But he is going to describe a sort of romantic poet's approach to specifically the monster. So the monster is very much a sympathetic character, even though it does bad things. Percy is sort of explaining Mary's thinking and the sort of general romantic approach to the creature of Frankenstein, and also the character of Victor, who has a little bit in common, you'll see, with Percy himself, which might not be a coincidence. But the whole point of the novel is not to be an allegory. We're going to start the novel next week, but I want to start by seeing it situated within this romantic, artistic way of thinking, and it's not there to teach us a lesson. There's no moral to the story of Frankenstein. It's not about how man should not play God, or scientists are bad, or what's the Jurassic Park version? You scientists spent so much time wondering if you could do this, you never stopped to ask yourself if you should do this. That kind of thing. that is very superficial from their perspective. They want us to understand why Victor does what he does. They want us to understand why the creature does what he does. And coming from this experience, the Romantics sort of looking back at the Enlightenment movement, the rise of science, but its detachment from emotion, from empathy, from social connection, from purpose, and seeing, okay, what happens when we have the science, we've got this emotion that we're not sure what to do with, and we don't know where to go. I shouldn't even say, like, this is what happens. I should say what could happen, or what sorts of things are in play when we bring these factors together. When we get to Frankenstein, you will see a lot of what we've already viewed from the Enlightenment intellectual shift, the rise of science, the political independence movements, the idea that we no longer have to look to the past. We can now find new knowledge ourselves that no ancient master had ever even encountered before. And yet at the same time, these questions about what do we do next? How far should we go? How fast should we go? And hopefully these readings will help us recognize that none of this literature is here to tell us this is how the world is. This is how people are. This is how people should be. This is what you should do, what you should think. It's all an exploration. It's an experience. And that is the Romantic writers, at least, that is their goal. Their goal is not to teach you a lesson. It is to make you stop and think, make you appreciate, make you wonder, make you feel. And then when you come back to your everyday life, be a little more aware, be a little more thoughtful, deliberate in your observations, your actions, your purposes.